Thanks for tuning in for one of our Sunday messages. At Red, we're continuing to lean into our vision of being a church of passionate and committed disciples who are devoted to Jesus' alternative for the world. If you're inspired or encouraged by the ministry of our church, we'd love to have you join us. You can find out more at redchurch.au.
So our Bible reading is from Acts 17, verses 22 to 31. Paul then stood up in the meeting of Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I am going to proclaim to you. Everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands, as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead."
Thank you, Lindy. This passage occurs in really what is one of the central cities, the capital of the Greek world at this time. And this is a really interesting transition in this book. Basically, what's happening in this book, it's telling the story of how the church grows, and it's telling the story of the apostle, means sent one from the Greek apostolos, and it's Paul going out into the world with the message of Jesus. But just before this, he's in another place called Berea. And in Berea, he's able to go and do what he usually does, which is go to a synagogue where people understand the Hebrew scriptures. And Paul himself, being a religious Jew, is then able to reason with them from the scriptures and talk about the coming of Jesus as the fulfillment of what the people of God were hoping for. But here we have Paul in a very different environment. Paul is in Athens. And as people hear him speaking in the marketplace, people are really interested in what he is saying. Again, Athens is like the one place which sets the intellectual temperature. The culture is set by there. It's like a global capital. And if people start thinking it in Athens, it's going to dribble down through the whole Greco-Roman world. And so Paul is invited to the Areopagus, this place where people sit around and talk about the latest ideas. This is the home of philosophy. And different philosophers battle to see what is the top thought sort of framework that people should have. There's the Epicureans, who believe that God is really far. There's a God, but he's not really interested in us. We should just be interested in what's happening in the world, and we should just have a good time. There's the Stoics, who sort of believe that God is God. They see God very differently. So there's these different competing factions of thoughts. And what's really interesting is Paul walks around Athens. The scriptures tell us that he's actually disturbed. On every corner, there seems to be a different kind of belief system. It's almost chaotic and confusing. And for him, a Jew who doesn't worship idols, he finds himself really disturbed. But what's interesting is that you see then when he's if you like, of new ideas in the Areopagus, instead of just sort of blurting out his frustration, like a preacher sort of judging people on a corner somewhere, he actually begins to build these bridges, and he actually refers to different philosophers, and he speaks to them in a really different way. And what's interesting is he notes that the context in which he's speaking has changed. John Stott, the famous Bible scholar and pastor, says this about this passage. It's not only the comprehensiveness of Paul's message in Athens, which is impressive. However, but also the depth and power of his motivation. Why is it that in spite of the great needs and opportunities of our day, the church slumbers peacefully on? I think the major reason is this: we do not speak as Paul spoke because we do not feel as Paul felt. Why is this? It takes us a stage back further. If we do not speak like Paul, it's because we do not feel like Paul. This is because we do not see like Paul. That was the order. And this is really key to hear this bit. Speaking of Paul, he saw, he felt, he spoke. It all began with his eyes. When Paul walked around Athens, he looked and thought until the fires of holy indignation were kindled within him. For he saw men and women created in the image of God, giving idols the homage which was due to him alone. It all began with his eyes. This wasn't Berea. This wasn't Paul's usual environments. He looked around and saw what was going on, that he'd actually changed context spiritually. And that's what I want us to do tonight. I want us to remember this passage, in a sense, look at our context with different eyes, to see that there's a change of context. As Ryan mentioned, we're in a series, The Furnace of Faith. And three of the core things that we feel that God is wanting to do through this time as we have our faith rekindled is actually pray as seeing people come to Jesus, people coming back to Jesus, and people falling more in love with Jesus. And so this is what Paul was all about. And so in this series, I'm going to do a bit of a sub-series for the next 4 weeks. So this series is going to go till September, but I'm going to do about a 4 or 5 week series. And what this is going to be about, if you were here last week, I spoke about how I returned from Europe a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things that really surprised me, having ministered in Europe before, is the dramatic turnaround that we're beginning to see, particularly amongst young people, coming to faith in what we thought were really secular environments. The story that we were told was that these places will inevitably be places where there's virtually no faith left, and that's the inevitable trajectory. But actually something really dramatic's happening. I won't go through all the stats I went through last week. If you want to listen to them all, maybe I'll just try and say them really fast. No. I'll say some fast. In the UK, 18 to 24-year-olds, 4% of 18 to 24-year-olds regularly went to church in 2018. Now it's 16% in 2024. It's quadrupled. 21% of Gen Z, it's almost 1 in 4 young men are now going to church monthly. Huge upticks in Finland. I did stuff previously a few years ago with Finnish leaders, like super secular, but now in Gen Z, like in a couple of years, like belief in God, belief in the resurrection of Jesus, like doubled in a couple of years. Something weird has happened in the last 18 months, 2 years. Adult baptisms in France increased by 30% in 1 year. Teen baptisms doubling. The Swedish Youth Trend Barometer, which every year says what's the new cool thing, in 2025 named Jesus as the influencer of the year that young people were looking to. In the Netherlands, the church has gone up in membership for the first time in decades. In Norway, I was in Norway for probably the longest part of my trip, and the church is rising, particularly amongst the young, almost surprising people. Belgium, 29% increase in young people identifying as Christians. Now, sometimes people from other churches in Australia listen to our podcast, and I got a message this week on Instagram. Someone just sent me a direct message basically saying they're in Tasmania, saying we're seeing it here, sharing that their youth group had doubled in size. And every week, new people not been to church turning up. I heard another story. I shared that anecdote this morning. Heard another story from another church in Tasmania where this is happening. Now, classically, when stuff like this happens, we would label it a revival. What a revival is when the church is revived. Another word we use is an awakening, where the church is awakened. But what's really interesting, there's some of that happening at some churches. But what I noticed traveling around is this is happening, but then in some churches are almost seemingly unaware of it. One of my friends whose church has had some of the most incredible people coming to faith from just like dreams and supernatural experiences, said that someone came out to them and said, I've been reading in the newspaper that there's something happening at our church. Is this true? And so there's this weird thing that even people in churches or leaders are not aware of this happening. So it's not like the church got super revived and people are on fire and out there preaching the gospel and people coming in. There's something happening outside of the church. So is this a revival? I don't know if we can call it that. I pray for revival. I hope for revival. But I think something else is happening. Now, what's interesting as well, as I've researched and thought about this and looked as Paul did, we see that something big is happening in the culture. You see, it's not just Christianity which people are looking to, but there's this significant turn happening to the spiritual, what formerly was seen as the irrational, and what was formerly seen as fringe. And I just had so many anecdotes, I thought I had to boil them down into just a few facts. So what I want to just give these few facts is to try and convince you that something is happening. Has there always been people that believe some spiritual things in a secular society? Absolutely. Has there always been some people who perhaps what we would call fringe beliefs? I remember when I started as a youth pastor, I did a small group, a Bible study with a group of kids. They were mostly church kids and they have Bible questions or whatever. But there was a guy, he was actually a great guy. He'd come from the local high school, no background in faith. And I just never forget the day. He was like, we finished the Bible study. He's like, werewolves, are they real? I was like, wow, it's actually a great conversation. So there's always the guy who wants to ask about werewolves. There's nothing new. But what's really interesting is that what's happening is this is moving into the mainstream. And you can even argue that what formerly was mainstream is now fringe, and what was fringe is now mainstream. One of my really just most regular reads, one of my sources of truth, Teen Vogue, says the following. Read it every day. Teen Vogue says the following. Young people, it's about what's happening. Young people are turning to crystals, tarot, astrology, and witchcraft, blending ancient wisdom with modern identity exploration. We have in our minds what are the main broadcasters of whether an idea is popular. I remember 20 years ago, this might be an editorial in The Age. It might be what is said on the ABC Channel 10. There used to be magazines in Australia, many of them no longer in print because of the sort of fall of the news media. Overseas, it might be CNN, it might be the Times in England. It might be these things which people held with sort of an esteem. But what we've seen is these things rapidly dropping in popularity, and really now some of the biggest things in the world are podcasts. The amount of listeners many different podcasts get just dwarfs cable TV, newspapers, network news. Joe Rogan's podcast, which is probably the biggest media platform in the world now, amplifies all kinds of fringe science, conspiracies, and spiritual themes because that's what the audience wants. Rogan himself remarked, the world is way weirder than we think, and the more I explore, the less I think we know. That is something that is listened everywhere because it has resonance with what people are feeling. So again, I say it's flipping over into the mainstream in a new way. In the last election in the US, one of the big things even happened here in the Australian election, you're now seeing prime ministers and presidential hopefuls going onto podcasts because they know that's where all the people are listening. Interestingly, this rise in spirituality and the occult is being noticed by marketers and brands. An article written in this year, just a couple of months ago, for a creative magazine, Creative Boom, proclaims that brands have entered what are called the season of the witch. Fascinating comments. As the world faces existential crises and the codes of success falter. Wow. Witchcraft offers a more than nostalgic aesthetic. It's a call to rethink brands, creativity, and connection. It goes on, as people look more towards the spiritual in times of uncertainty, brands must do the same to prove that they can bridge the gap between the modern secular world and the ancient natural one. Brands need to act as healers, conduits, antidotes, and comforters amidst the fear and overwhelm we feel. I could have given more from different branding articles talking about this, but time is short. If you think that is just there, in the Imperial and King's College in London, a very respectable medical institution is currently researching the effect of psychedelics and the links between spirituality and the brain. They're studying not just therapy, but they're literally creating a map of what they're calling the hallucinatory worlds. What they're trying to work out is why, when people in different parts of the world take these psychedelic substances like psilocybin and MDMA, why do people meet the same entities? Why do they see the same landmarks? Alternative magazine is reported on the growing trend among CEOs and business leaders using psychedelics like ayahuasca, LSD, and magic mushrooms to foster creativity, problem-solving skills, and leadership quality. No longer is this hippies or certain people. There's always been people who have taken psychedelics, but this is now moving into the mainstream. Business Insider reports on how top CEOs and leaders, even Prince Harry, are now doing this. They say this, it's something more top dogs should give a go, says investor Eddie Weisberg, 33. He said ayahuasca could help founders, basically silicon founders and company founders, gain better insights into themselves and others. Essentially, your entire compass as a founder can shift, Weisberg says, a managing partner at a venture capital firm, MindEd Ventures. He said ayahuasca, which is a plant-based psychedelic, can bring increased clarity and help leaders run their teams better. I spoke to one pastor in the US who said that the main competition in his area now is actually psychedelic churches, and people are leaving Christian churches to go to psychedelic churches. Now, just to add some more on how things have shifted, the US Congress is currently exploring and having subcommittees around what we'd formerly call UFOs or UAPs. And as this discussion has continued, many of the Congress people and senators are actually seeing this not about aliens and technology, but actually about the spiritual. One congressperson said to the Futurism magazine, these are not just foreign objects. There is a possibility of spiritual forces at work, and we need to be vigilant. Okay, my final piece of evidence is going to be a video. If you think about what is the most mainstream news source in the world, what is the sort of gold standard? Probably it's what the Age copies, it's what so many papers copy. It's actually probably the New York Times. The center of New York's probably the global capital still of the world. And the New York Times is in many ways still the gold standard, fact-checking all of this stuff. Now, there's an interview that came out last week in the New York Times, and it was between one of their journalists, Ross Douthat, who also happens to be a Christian, and the tech billionaire and intellectual in Silicon Valley, Peter Thiel. He was one of the first investors in Facebook, is involved with Palantir, which is one of the world's biggest sort of AI data firms, which sort of involved with everything from the CIA's data to the NHS's data in the UK. Just a massive company, surveillance stuff. He's involved in defense contracts. Just huge power. He was one of the first investors that put money into Donald Trump's 2016 campaign. And so they're having a conversation last week. And what's really interesting is that Peter Thiel, over the last little while, is giving lectures in Silicon Valley at universities, places like Stanford, about the possibility that where AI is going is creating the Antichrist. Now, I'm not going to do a sermon here on the Antichrist, right? I did a sermon on Revelation. We may look at Revelation again in the future. I am more showing this as an example of how mainstream conversation is shifting towards spiritual ideas that were formerly fringe. There's always been people talking about the Antichrist. There was horror movies in the 70s about the Antichrist, but this is the New York Times and one of the most powerful people, not just shaping culture in Silicon Valley, but culture in the world. And what's great about this clip, not what's great, but what's fascinating about this clip, it's only about a minute or two, is you get to the end of it. It goes for an hour. You get to the end of it, and what Thiel is arguing that AI is going to come, it's going to create this sort of one world government. And he says a figure like will be an Antichrist will arise, and he's arguing that basically it'll be a figure like Greta Thunberg. And Ross Douthat, sort of, you watch this as it happens. Ross Douthat's like, okay, he's listening to this. And then Ross Douthat, the journalist, goes, hang on, wouldn't it be a figure more like you? Someone who controlled all this AI and data and weapons. And so watch in real time as a New York Times journalist sort of basically asks Peter Thiel, one of the big tech investors, intellectuals in the world, if he possibly could be ushering in the Antichrist. Welcome to mainstream media. Let's run the video.
Los Alamos that people are afraid of. And I guess this is my very specific question for you, right? Is that you're an investor in AI. You're deeply invested in Palantir, in military technology, in technologies of surveillance, in technologies of warfare, and so on, right? And it just seems to me that when you tell me a story about the Antichrist coming to power and using the fear of technological change to sort of impose order on the world, I feel like that Antichrist would maybe be using the tools that you were building, right? Like, wouldn't the Antichrist be like, great, we're not going to have any more technological progress, but I really like what Palantir has done so far, right?
Yeah,
I mean, isn't that a concern? Wouldn't that be the irony of history would be that the man publicly worrying about the Antichrist accidentally hastens his or her arrival?
There are all these different scenarios. I obviously don't think that that's what I'm doing.
Now, again, too, this is not going to segue into a sermon about the Antichrist or the book of Revelations. More I just put up there, I'm just watching this going, wow. Here is mainstream news, and these are the discussions being had at really high levels of power. Something is shifting. And we can miss this because in many ways we've been shaped by a story. And this story has probably existed most of your life. It shapes how you perhaps view faith. It shapes how you interact with other people who maybe don't have faith. It may shape some of your explorations of faith. And to explain this story, I just want to take you back a few weeks ago when Rob, who's a friend who's from the Church of Ireland, was taking me on a trip from Northern Ireland. We drove all the way to Dublin. And he stopped off, I've got a picture here, at a place called Monster Boys, which is a 5th century monastic community in County Louth in Ireland. This was a really early centre of prayer, worship, and mission. You can see on your right a high Celtic cross. The ancient Celts saw the sun as a god, and St. Patrick came and he said, no, it's not, the sun is not a god, it's the Son of God. And he sort of basically put that sun symbol in a cross. And all up and down, you can see some intricate carvings, is the stories of Scripture in the Gospels for people who couldn't read. And these became teaching tools. You'll notice the extremely high tower, which is when the Vikings would attack. They would hide up the tower. But these little, very marginal little monastic communities were really what was evangelized Ireland and then evangelized Europe. But what was interesting is you can see something else happening in this picture, that you'll notice that there's a bunch of people in the foreground. The majority of them are American tourists, but you can see one guy with his hand up, and he's wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and he was an Irish tour guide. And so Rob and I, Rob knows so much about this. He's part of the Church of Ireland. Some of them would trace their history back to St. Patrick. And Rob and I were listening, and I knew enough to realize, hang on, the story that the guide was telling was not exactly kosher. And the story he was saying was this. This is an ancient monastic site of the Irish people. And in a place like this, they had these scrolls. And as the rest of the world went through the Dark Ages and lost the art of reading, and they lost so much knowledge that the ancients had, that in places like this, the ancient Irish protected mathematics. They protected some of the knowledge of the old gods and philosophy, because the church was wanting to squash all of this. So us, the Irish, we know that there are other gods as there was across Europe, and we protected this knowledge like maths. And it's the church that actually wanted to squash this knowledge. It's brilliant. Rob looks at me and he goes, classic Irish. They're just making it all up for money. So, mate, you said that, not me. And what's interesting is that this is a very convenient retelling of history. It's more like a Dan Brown retelling of history. Because there wasn't some church that was some big institution. Literally, this little small space with a wall around it was the church. And they weren't being attacked by some big institutional church who wanted to, attack mathematics. They were actually being attacked by the Vikings, hence the big tower they would have to hide up when the pagan Vikings would come to attack them. But really what this story is not an ancient one, it's a modern one. It's a story that is about post-Christianity. It's about secularism. I got another chart up here which explains this. It's this idea that at one point we were Christian, but now we've moved beyond Christianity. That what we're defined by is not like the past, but moving on to something else. To define post-Christianity, I would say this: post-Christian society is one that was once shaped by Christianity, but now sees itself as having moved beyond it. It may still desire the values and goals of Christianity, the kingdom without the king, but views Christian faith as outdated, acceptable only in private, and sometimes even offensive. A post-Christian society sees itself as secular. See, this so often frames how society has seen faith. This has been the story of how particularly societies like Australia have seen faith over the last sort of 30, 40 years, probably particularly from the 1960s onwards. And what this means is that if you're a Christian and you really believe this stuff, like I think many of you do that knowing that you're seen by the society as something passé, out of date, bit strange, like maybe me telling other people is not good, that there's actually something wrong with you. And the sense that if I bring this up in a room, like I'm somehow beyond the pale, that there's something wrong with what I'm believing. But what's interesting is when we return to Paul, and we've got the verse here, in Acts 17, verse 23, Paul says this. Again, he's looked around. Athens at the time was described as a great shrine. There was all kinds of belief everywhere. But Paul's saying to the Athenians, hang on, you're all worshiping these different stuff, but I just saw this really ancient, like stone to the unknown God, that underneath this, there's actually some belief that no one is truly articulating. So he says this, he says, people of Athens, you're ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. And I want to argue that we think we're post-Christian, or Australian society thinks it's post-Christian, or a lot of the world thinks it's post-Christian. But actually, you can't be defined just against something. You actually believe in something. See, actually, we're not really so post-Christian. Secularism isn't an absence of belief. And what I'm going to argue over the next few weeks, and again, so I'm just going to really quickly go over these three elements now. And these three elements are what I think are the real beliefs of secularism or post-Christianity. And these things, if you've gone to uni, if you talk to people, no one names these, but these are behind so many things. Again, if you're a student, as I know some of you are, and you're at university, you're going to encounter these things. You'll probably encounter these in your workplaces. These are like the unspoken things that shape so much of our culture. And I'll try to take so much stuff and just blend it into three simple ideas. Number one, materialism. Everything is matter. Basically, only the physical world matters. So whether it's your personal life, whether it's an ethical decision, whether it's how do we do society here in Melbourne, our world tells us that it's only what you can see, measure, or change. That's all that's real. And the problem is what this does is it turns everything, even people, into objects. It objectifies everything. Again, I'm just going to go over this real quickly. We'll dig into them in the next few weeks if you don't get them all now. Now, the interesting thing is, the second thing is control. If everything is physical, then it can be controlled. If everything is matter, you can control it. And this leads to a strong desire to have power over nature, our bodies, reality. And if we can just find the right tools, the right techniques, and the right technology, it's going to solve everything. Hence why we have Silicon Valley now saying we can actually get beyond our humanity, or we can create artificial intelligence that's going to have godlike abilities. And if everything's material, it means everything can be controlled. But then if you can control it, you can maximize everything. See, once we can control things, we try and make everything faster, bigger, and more productive. So this means the company's got to be made more efficient. The health service has got to be made more efficient. And it's got to get faster, bigger, make more money, more productive. Or you've got to squeeze all this productivity out of every minute of your life and get a better and better person to compete with others. And these three beliefs are the modern gospel behind everything. And underneath this, there's three promises. That if we do these things, the post-Christian world says we're moving beyond Christianity because we're going somewhere better. That if we do these things, we're going to improve the world, we're going to improve society, and we're going to improve your life. And for some times, I think secularism was attractive because it seemed like this was happening. If you saw the advances that happened from the 1960s to the 1970s to the 1980s to the 1990s, technologically, economically, the world, like trying to fly across the world in 1965 was really hard. A personal computer was gigantic. It barely fit into a room. So for a while, it seemed like you didn't need God because the world was improving. Healthcare got better. Technology got better. We seemed to have solutions for international problems. It seemed like the world was sliding towards something better. But I think one of the reasons is that all of a sudden we're seeing a shaking of this belief is that actually we're starting to see that these things are not making our world better. That maximization is burning us out. It's also burning our world out. That we've seen the limits of control, that we can't control everything. That when we reduce everything to matter, we objectify everything and we take all of the mystery and wonder and grandeur out of God's creation. And we just see people use each other. And so what we're seeing across the world is the majority of people in the world don't believe things will be better in 50 years. I just read a couple of reports, which actually, I read a lot of this stuff. I was surprised by the level of dissatisfaction in the world. The UN social report from this year found that most people in the world think that the world in 50 years' time is not going to be better. It says this, despite significant human progress, nearly 60% of people across the world said they're struggling, and another 12% said they're suffering. This widespread disillusionment reflects a deep uncertainty about the future. The findings reveal a stark contradiction. This is really interesting. While humanity benefits from remarkable advances in healthcare, technology, and education, these improvements haven't led to a greater happiness or stronger sense of security. Instead, anxiety, growing inequality, and mistrust in institutions are clouding global outlooks. The Edelman Trust Barometer, done every year, every country gets a number and the world gets a number about how people think about the future. It says only 1/3 of respondents believe that the next generation will be better off. In every Western democracy, 30% or fewer believe so. In Germany, just 14% of people believe the next generation will be better off. In France, it's just 7%. There is a link between 30% of French baptisms going up and teens doubling in baptisms, and that statistic, that 9% believe the future is going to be better. Like 5 different reasons that Edelman found out why this is. That there is this sense of pessimism about the future, that there's growing inequality, inequality eats at trust, that people don't trust leaders, and that people can't even agree on shared facts anymore. And so this is eating our belief in the future. So to begin to land this plane, as I just set out where we're going in this series, is that I think what we're seeing is not so much a revival of Christianity. As I said, pray for revival. I think if the church positions itself and prepares itself for what God wants to do, we can see revival. But what we're not so much seeing a revival of Christianity as we're seeing the beginning of the decline in secularism. I'll say that again. We're not seeing so much a revival of Christianity as the beginning of a decline in secularism. And I think this is just going to increase. And so what this means is we are moving into something new. But I just want to say, as Paul walked into a new environment in Athens and he looked around and some of the things disturbed him, we read that he was disturbed. That because he was close to God, because he didn't just look and worry, he looked and saw the opportunities in the moment, that he was then able to make a gap to the culture and reach people who at that moment were actually looking for good news. So what does this mean? I just want to give you some practicals. We're going to dig into this stuff as we go forward, but just some practicals. Number 1, we're facing a unique evangelistic moment as many people are open to faith amid society struggles. A lot of people have said to me, like, oh, you've seen all this stuff in Europe and we're getting this data from Europe. There's not been a lot of great data done in the last 2 years in Australia. But as I said, there's got to be some reason why I'm getting reports from like Tasmania that there's a youth group that's doubled and people are coming to faith. I actually think that out there, people are seeing this and the conversation's changing out there. It flies under the mainstream media often because, again, the mainstream media is no longer mainstream. It's really fringe, and it's like not showing the real reading of what's going on. So actually, there is a unique evangelistic moment that we are seeing as the church. So secondly, what this means is we need to rethink how we see faith's role in society. It really recognize it as a fresh and relevant alternative to the failing promises of secularism. I saw a picture this week of Keanu Reeves, who has just become Orthodox. And there are multiple people who, I was talking to people in Europe, are turning up at churches which look very little like the world, Orthodox churches, traditional Catholic churches, and so on. And what this means is that people are looking for new things. That actually we've got a generation who've had a few decades of secularism, and all of a sudden for them, they have lack of faith in the gospel of the culture, and they're looking for new alternatives. So what this might mean is if in a conversation at work, your faith comes up. Maybe 10 years ago, that would be a stomach-churning moment potentially for you because you're thinking, man, the whole room's going to turn on me. I remember 5 years ago, someone at Red who basically had their boss come up to them and say, you're a Christian, is this going to be a problem? And, we have this new reality where actually people in the room may not be talking about this, but actually everyone is asking questions. So many of the stories, can I just feed you back? We're getting pastorally of people getting into conversations. After the sermon I gave this morning at Nunawading, someone came out to me and said, probably every second day they're having a spiritual conversation with people who are just asking questions. Something's happening out there. We need to shake off this sort of post-Christian story that we've had that we're somehow passé or irrelevant. People are increasingly interested. Are there still a bunch of people running on the old software? 100%. But increasingly people are looking around. And what this means is, my third point, is that the countercultural and different aspects of Christianity are attracting people more than before. The historian Tom Holland said, when asked about what should the church do, is like the church shouldn't get rid of all the weird stuff. It's the weird stuff that people are now interested in, the spiritual stuff, the stuff about there's got to be something more than this. There's a lot of being in this series of God speaking to us personally about the furnace of faith and what he's doing in us. But what I want to do is I want to pray, and I want to pray that just as Paul had new eyes to see what was happening, that we will have new eyes. If you're exploring faith, this is a fantastic time to do this because there's a bunch of people doing this. But also sometimes we can almost have a sort of cloak where we put it on, and it's a cloak of shame because of this story that's gone for some time, epitomized by the Irish storyteller. And, I just feel like actually God is inviting us into some new ways of looking. And as that John Stott said that when Paul saw, it's like he saw differently, and this led him to feel differently. So Jesus, we recognize that things are changing. The secular story that has promised so much is falling over. And we just confess that sometimes we've bought part of that. That sometimes we've bought this fear, that even it's brought doubt in at times. But we're at a moment where there is just a tremendous openness beginning. We see people looking in all different places. But I know that everyone in this room is connected to other people, that there's friends and co-workers, and classmates, and neighbors, family, who at this moment are looking for hope. There is just profound hopelessness in the world. And so Jesus, as the church, at this moment, we just pray for divine appointments, for just conversations to flow. Point us to the people who are seeking. And God, I just pray, Father, for just an awakening where we begin to see, God, I just feel like there's this moment where people are starting to see through the lies outside of the church, and the church at this moment needs to be woken up. So God, wake us up. It's like a revival happening outside of the church. So for goodness sake, God, please help us to see and feel and look and see how you look at the world with love. I think about how in Scripture, Jesus has said, you look on the crowds with compassion, harried and lost. May we look on our society and see the people looking for you, Jesus. And we thank you, Jesus. We thank you that you're doing something new. And so we just pray, come, Holy Spirit, in this moment, move amongst us. Change our hearts. Change our eyes. Help us to see what you're doing.